among yourselves. Let me put my reading glasses on. Been talking about pathways to legalisation. Now, it'll be on YouTube. You're videoing. Hello over there, and we'll try and crack a few jokes to keep things entertaining. But the pathways to legalisation are both many and varied and elusive, because in our country, Australia, it'd probably be easier to do a shit on the moon than it is to legalise cannabis recreationally. The legalisation under medical guidelines has worked to some extent, but there's still a massive black market industry and people can't grow themselves, so now we're trying to get it legal that way. We're reliant upon our system of democracy, which is representative democracy, so we elect people to Parliament who will then work on our issues. Unfortunately, that is not a good way to get instant results, and we're stuck with a whole bunch of fairly restrictive pathways that rely upon, trying to propose changes to legislation, the Legalised Cannabis Party getting members in, the Greens supporting it, the major parties ignoring it. And now we've got more inquiries. We've got a federal inquiry. We had a big inquiry in Victoria. Now we've got one in New South Wales. And these are the pathways upon us. If anyone has any good ideas on other pathways, we could do it. But I'll just hand you briefly over to Mr. Moylan, who will give you his overview of the pathways. Thank you, James.
Right. The problem with Australia is when we put the country together, we seem to adopt a lot of the worst aspects from both the Washington and the Westminster system. So there's good aspects of Australia. We came up with what might be considered a democratic socialist state to some extent, but along the way, the Constitutional Convention's dropped all of the facility for public initiated referendum, direct democratic action, right? All of the ways that you see a lot of comparable Western world countries acting, those pressure points that have allowed the issue of cannabis to be addressed in a relatively rational fashion. It's important to preface it with all of this because this speaks to the pathways for legalisation that are available. In a lot of other countries, there's citizen-initiated referenda, things like that, which provide for the citizenry direct action relating to matters as significant to individual citizens as cannabis use. In Australia and other comparable Commonwealth countries, the problem is that most of these countries lack that citizen-initiated focus, especially in Australia. And so we work on a party system where outside of that party system, there are very few avenues for direct legislative action. There's pressure upon those groups to act, but outside of those parties, it's almost impossible to fashion rational legislation and pass it unless there's really broad support for the particulars involved. Now, when talking about the available pathways, all of this has to be considered. In the Australian environment, we have shared responsibilities at federal and state level. Different responsibilities, that's it. State and federal levels are responsible for different things. On federation, a lot of the responsibilities were mapped out, passed over to the federal government, and it's all set up that way. Unfortunately, cannabis falls halfway. What we've done during the last 20 years is set up a TGA framework under what we call cooperative federalism. Because the federal government and the state governments have different responsibilities, right, then when there is broad consensus that we need to change the law and do it best, what we do is we have a Senate Select Committee which brings in all of the states. We set up umbrella legislation at the federal level. The states go home, pass referral legislation right, which is in common, and we do it cooperatively, right? But as it stands with marijuana, the federal government is generally much further ahead of most of the states, but unfortunately the federal government is not responsible for law and order in the states. This wasn't a power that was referred. The current TGA framework was set up in a cooperative fashion, cooperative federalism, right, to enable therapeutic goods during the 80s, and recently, during the last 8 years, marijuana, right? Some changes at the federal level provided the facility for, in each of the states, for citizenry to buy marijuana. Now, of course, the best way forward in an ideal world with cannabis law reform in Australia would be simply to put together a federal convention, right, and do it in cooperative federalism and rationally, but that's not going to happen. That is just simply not going to happen. Not for a very long time, right? The pathways that are available therefore shrink down to what existing legislation there is and what can we advise them to do. My response to this, and it's a complicated topic, because law is always complicated, especially constitutional law. My response to this is the available pathways that we should be pushing for, because we're not going to get everything we want, is just to use the existing TGA framework. It's currently enabled the distribution of medicinal cannabis at the state level, right? Just by passing legislation at the federal level, it can enable the states to move beyond medicinal cannabis to regulating recreational cannabis at the state level. Now, this is just the nuts and bolts of how we can accomplish this. I'm not going to go deeply into the details of it, because, you know, it's the very first iterations of recreational cannabis in each of the states of Australia will be very highly regulated, massively and disproportionately regulated. And I say this just simply because that's what's happened everywhere else in the world that it's happened. I suggest that we can hurry this along by, at the federal level, suggesting alterations to the current TGA and suggesting at each of the state levels that they promulgate legislation under the TGA framework relating to recreational, particularly dispensaries and cultivation of Indian hemp at home for, first of all, medicinal reasons, and then after that, recreational reasons. Now, the focus on that direction is just simply because it doesn't take a lot to accomplish that. It doesn't take a lot of movement at the federal level, and there's good arguments for it. What you do is you basically provide a facility for the federal government to say, well, we're responsible under our system for medicinal matters and therapeutic goods, but each of the states are responsible for matters to do with crime and punishment and intoxicants. That's our system. So we've got the responsibility.
Intoxicants.
All we need to do, well, social intoxicants, because the fact is that anyone who needs medicinal cannabis in Australia can now get it. The real problem is not medicinal cannabis. The real problem is that those who use recreational cannabis in Australia are required to either lie to a doctor or behave illegally. That's where we've got to do.
Which they do.
And so, because we're not going to get any radical change, my suggestion is always to focus on minor incremental change at the federal level, providing the facilities for the states to use the existing legislative framework, right? And at the state level, pointing out that, well, being a hypocrite, being a politician, pointing out to each different group, right, the particulars. The National Party have a new crop, right? The Labor Party can wedge the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party are unreachable, the Liberal Party will come at commercial propositions. You point to America at the moment, $33.8 billion final cash turnover for medicinal cannabis in the US. Now, if you want a real world price on that, triple it, and you've got some idea of the actual turnover, right? And when you bring into account the illegal activity in that sphere, it's those sort of figures do make even a far right-wing person's eyes light up. They tend to be that way. So
money.
Yeah. So when talking about pathways, it's important to have these discussions because a lot of our discussion is focused on the best possible outcomes, the best way it could possibly be. And all of that's important. It's important for PR and everything. But at the practical level, right, the response by our politicians, the Hemp Party politicians around Australia, I suggest should always keep their eyes focused directly on the existing pathways of power, right, and just incrementally moving it in our direction. Because remember that...
How's that going, James, the incremental moving of the pathways?
Well, it's going forward and backward.
It's like a constipated wound.
Well,
like I said, it'd be easier to do a shit on the name than it would be to legalise cannabis here recreationally.
40 years ago, I was locked up in Silverwater Penitentiary for 45 days for 3 plants that tall. Now, I don't think that would happen now. I don't think the same thing would happen. We have to be real about this. When I was young, cannabis was grossly illegal, right, and was unknown in the mainstream population, right? It is a very different world today. But we can't pat ourselves on the back about that. I think that most of the change in the Australian cultural matrix has come from that bleed, the vicarious bleed from overseas where it is legal. We have such a vast amount of American media in our lives, right, that the common sense of the Americans regarding cannabis has started to bleed into Australia. So, yeah, I don't think we've done much at all.
Not far enough.
But that's why the topic of available pathways. Another thing that's important in this, when you focus on the existing legislative structures, it means that when you're talking about cannabis at the state level, you get to dangle money in front of the politicians. You just point out that it
doesn't always work. If it was just about the money, we would win.
But it is to an
ethical kind of attachments.
You can point out that if you allow states to
Sue. A round of applause for Sue, please. Cleaning the seats here. Good on you, Sue. Thank you very much. That's okay.
If you allow the states to each to their own develop their own retail sector, right? It means that it's a good approach because the slowest states, right, will always be slow, but the ones who are on the verge that are most likely, like Western Australia and Tasmania, won't be held back by the majority, right, providing that facility for... And I would suggest that in the Australian instance, the most important thing, right, for the movement as a whole, right, the biggest outcomes that we could see that would really change it is to actually see retail outlets for cannabis on the main street in Australia, right?
Should they be on the main street or should they be around the side? Or
no, well, look, I want to see them in.
Do we want big neon signs with dope webs and bombs on the street?
Well, that's the way they're doing it in Thailand, and it seems to be working for the Thais.
I don't have a problem with it, but you know, will Parliament here warm to those kind of ideas, James?
It's a literary term to refer to we need in the Australian retail environment cannabis retail outlets that are not dispensaries. They're not medicinal. This is recreational cannabis being used by people who want to get stoned. You see, we have a resistance in Australia to adopting a discussion about the reality that we all face. If you listen to the discussion at a lot of these forums, everyone here is sick. We all need medicinal cannabis. And how many people do you say, well, look, I use cannabis because I like having a damn big bong in the morning and getting ripped off my tits. Whereas that's the reality for most of us. Most of us aren't recreational medicinal users. We've been forced to be hypocrites. I haven't ever had a script. I refuse to engage in that sort of hypocrisy. I use cannabis to get very stoned, and I use it recreationally. I think I have every right, and I don't think I should have to lie to a doctor to be able to do that. All right?
Yes, no problem.
All right, so...
It'd be nice. It'd be nice.
Sounds great.
But the pathway to that...
Ideal reality, ideal reality.
The pathway to that is everywhere you look around the world, there's never accepting for in Thailand. In comparable jurisdictions, I haven't seen that sudden leap forward. There's, even in places like Canada, you look at the history of the developments toward, right? It was slow gestational and incremental legal growth all the way until you end up with a bitzer of a system that's horrible, right? But it actually provides people with cannabis without having the police breathing down their necks.
They're the problem.
That would
Yes,
be nice.
later on in the piece, when you look at the trajectory of the legalisation system in California, you see the natural development. First of all, medicinal, right? Well, first of all, in an entirely illegal situation. First of all, medicinal. There it happened with the AIDS outbreak, right? They put together cannabis buyers clubs. Federal government allowed medicinal. State level, they exploited it to the max. Put together the marijuana card. Made virtually everything treatable by marijuana. They pushed and pushed and pushed, with pushback all the way from the authorities. At every step of it, the legal and regulatory environment was incoherent and frenetic, changing constantly and not rational, but moving, right? Until some 16 years ago, virtually everyone in California could get cannabis recreational or medicinal. And at that point, and since then, there's been a large fight happening in the legislatures in California, which has come to a head over the last 3 years with a total reformulation of this total bitzer system that they had, which was incremental and developed, with a whole new system which is rational and wonderful. But I'm not really happy with it because the outcome in the end is pretty much for the whole of the industry to bend over to big business. It has now become a huge...
Snoop Dogg. Is Snoop Dogg big
activity.
business?
So you end up in America, the discussion between decriminalisation and legalisation there is very different to in Australia. It means different things. In Australia, we seem to think of it as synonymous, but in America, it provides for a break between that original collectivist, buyers collective idea of cannabis being freely available to everyone who wanted it without a massive corporate overstructure, as against that full laissez-faire corporatist approach. In the end, in line with America, of course, the laissez-faire corporatist approach wins out. But when we're looking at everything that's happening overseas, we have to look at it in the clear light of what outcomes we really want and whether or not even what seems to be the ideal of America is what we want. Do we want really a society?
Do we want to be like America?
Yes. No! Australia
A bit, but not a lot.
Like in America, they followed the prohibition of alcohol model. They've done exactly the same thing again with cannabis. And they just start to push it, so everyone's got a brand. It's like pink gin and all kinds of tequilas. It's the same thing.
Snoop Dogg weed.
Every kind of
Willie Nelson's got his own weed. Willie weed.
and you know,
Mike Tyson's got his own strain.
the only way, the only possible model that can really work is that we can grow our own. And that way we don't have to get these spongy little kind of buds that you don't know what.
Oh look,
But the
it's
major
true.
difference, the major
True.
difference between the US and Australia, right, which has to be stressed and stressed again and again, is that when you look at the people who are in favour of legal cannabis and people in America who are in favour of illegal cannabis, there was a national poll only 8 months ago, right, which asked exactly that question. In Australia, right, some 62% of Australians believe that cannabis should be decriminalised, right, and around 40% believe it should be fully legal, right? What do you think it is in America at the moment?
In USA, the reason that cannabis became illegal was a prohibition and like for racism. And
Oh no, that's a bit of a gloss actually. That's just America taking responsibility for everything. Look, cannabis was made illegal in Europe, and we've actually all the laws that we have all around the world follow the basic models of prohibition that were first of all pioneered by the English, right? And we've all modelled on that. Of course, the Americans want to say that
In
they,
Switzerland in 1868, to be
You know.
honest.
right?
Just how effective the Canberra model has been, where it seems to be, it seems on one hand to me to get around a bit of the issue of, I don't particularly want to see super large corporations growing and pushing weed. I don't think that's necessarily even a good thing to have particularly. But something like the Canberra model, which allows for almost, you could change it to almost have a small scale sort of growing and cultivation. And
Well,
decriminalisation of possession.
the argument in the US is very different because the whole debate is over, right? As I said, more than 5,000 people across all of America, and 92% in favour of full legalisation. 92%. I will repeat that. 92% of Americans in favour of full legalisation. That is the reason that it's changed in America, not because of anything that the politicians have done. The politicians are responding, right? And similarly, no matter what anyone here wants to tell you, it won't change in Australia until the social dialogue and the opinion of the majority changes.
That would be good.
Until we get rid of the constant mythology about cannabis being a relatively dangerous drug, right? Constantly. Why have we got all of these rules to protect us against A, what harm, B, to whom?
That's why the medicinal model is better.
Yeah, but the
It's
medicinal
not
model...
bad, but like you were saying before about self-grow, how do you structure that here? Like in America, they realised that if they didn't allow people to self-grow, then they would keep doing it illegally. And so even the medicinal states have self-grow, so does recreation. It's just part of with it. In Australia, it's a completely different kettle of fish. Like if you go and talk to these politicians about this issue, right, it's a fuckwit zone. Like they don't have common human decency that it's not a good idea to arrest people, you know.
See, all the people in these tents
They haven't got there yet.
seem to think that in the political discussions that are occurring in Macquarie Street and in Canberra, they're having close considered discussion of all these matters. No, it's a bunch of ignorant white puffy fellas who are repeating drug war nonsense.
But you know what? They'll follow.
They're still there.
They'll follow America.
Now, for anyone who doubts this,
We wish they would follow America. We'd have direct democracy and we could vote for the issue like they did.
just
in
for
America.
anyone who doubts or wonders why, right, remember that in Australia almost all of our press is far right or far right wing, right? And
or left out.
And look at the treatment of cannabis in the Australian press. None of the Murdoch press in America would dare to tell their readership any of the nonsense in our papers, because 92% of Americans hold they know, they understand that it's not dangerous. If you try and tell them it's a dangerous drug, they laugh in your face.
Well, that's come through the legalisation. It's widely accepted in most American states. There'll be states where it's not.
That's why.
But here, the level of pig-headed ignorance when you try and talk to politicians is stunning. So, James, what do you think is the pathway to alleviate this ignorance? How could we tackle it in a successful manner?
Well, I've just done a doctorate on semiotics, which is all very it's just meaning systems analysis, right? And the reality is that when you look at all of the activity of all of the lawmakers and all of the agitators in Australia, over the last 40 years in Australia, it doesn't seem to have changed things much at all when you weigh it up against just that vicarious bleed from overseas.
Yeah, you're having the same argument.
Yeah. It doesn't, because of the structural limitations in Australia, because of the lack of paths. There's a lack of pathways, right? The Australian discussion seems to be absolutely stuck in that 1950s dangerous drug rhetoric.
It's psychotic!
You know,
it'll make you mad!
Now,
maybe that's the solution, is to reschedule the drug, like they're starting to do in America.
Yeah, but have you seen the form for the rescheduling at the TVA, mate? You need a university degree in like, you know, industrial biochemics to understand the form.
Where, for example, you pass a law that all plants are no longer illegal. No plant.
But that's not
what
the rescheduling is about. What is the rescheduling about?
Takes years of argument.
You change it from being a debate about cannabis to a debate about plant medicine. And that there's a lot of evidence now for the...
Plant medicine is fully legal in Australia. Cannabis plant medicine is fully legal. There's plant medicine clinics all over the place. There's giant cannabis factories producing it to TGA 9.3 quality assurance.
But I'm not after plant medicine. I want a big block of hash that's really, really ruddy that I can rub a bit off, whack in my morning cones and get baked. I mean, totally fucked up. No, look, I'm just pointing out.
Recreational.
I'm pointing out I'm not going to hide behind medicinal. I'm not using a medicinal plant. I'm using a plant that will get me ripped. I'm after recreational cannabis, and
He wants to enjoy it.
Now, I am sick of constantly having to use these weasel words about, oh, well, it's good for my health and blah-de-blah-de-blah. No, I have every fucking right to get ripped to the tits.
My dealer is my healer.
Yeah, I have every right to get ripped to the tits. It doesn't hurt anyone else in the world, and I don't care what euphemisms you want to use for your drinking, but I doubt it's socialisation. I doubt that you're going to the pub every Friday to just be there with the boys. I think you're drinking to get drunk, just like so many people. And you guys can engage in all of this bullshit. I smoke cannabis to get stoned. I like being
Round of applause
stoned.
for Jim, please.
These are things that have to be part of the conversation. We have to replace the weasel words with acknowledgement of the reality. There is nothing wrong with wanting to get stoned. There's nothing wrong with wake and bake.
How's that working out for you? How's that working out with the popularity department?
Well, it certainly does work. Right.
What, saying all I want to do is get stoned?
No, it certainly...
Well, it's the basis of recreational cannabis
work
as
too.
opposed to...
How are you going to bump up the population? I don't think so.
Well, I'm not
That's
interested in the population.
I thought you said you wanted to be like America, get 92, and that's how you're going to get the laws changed.
Yes, when it changes. Did I say that I think the law is going to change any time in the next 50 years?
America's opinion changed. It changed because they started to do the medical model.
Yes.
That's how it changed.
And I'd say it'll take approximately the same length of time in Australia.
But what we need to do is not not have a
which means, by your estimation, I'll be able to get ripped on recreational cannabis about 20 years after I'm dead. Yeah, I mean, it's just not good enough for me. I am sick of engaging this on everyone else's terms. I started smoking when I was 13. I've smoked legal cannabis in 6 countries and never in my own.
But that's fine, but how's that working out in terms
Shame. That's right. It's embarrassing.
Yeah, how does it change the law? By stating the reality. All of this common statements that I'm making are utterly unremarkable in the American context.
I think
And
They're
European.
considered amazing
they
here.
are here too. I think everyone knows everyone's using weed to get stoned.
Yeah, I know, so let's start acknowledging that fact. We know that. Mr. and Mrs. Dopey, who know nothing about cannabis, don't
A lot
know
of the
that.
time, yeah.
They know nothing about cannabis. They think that their kid is going to get addicted to it, right, and end up in a gutter homeless. Why? Because we're talking nonsense, old drug war mythology stuff, right? We're not acknowledging, A, people smoke cannabis to get stoned, B, it's not going to create a great deal of harm.
I think you're going to convince the parent more by putting to evidence and showing them the benefits of cannabis than by saying to them, all I want to do is get stoned, okay? That's not going to convince any parent to allow their kids to start smoking weed.
I didn't say that to
But
convince anyone.
how many kids have
I'm
asked their
just sick
parents
to
if
death
they
of
can
having to
smoke
dance
weed?
around
You
it.
just need to convince them it's not harmful.
Yes.
Did you ask your parents if you could smoke weed?
Motivation's irrelevant.
No,
The main point is
no, I
it's not
didn't.
harmful.
They told me not to. I went and got
Grabbed a
some.
hold of rhetoric
He's
instead
an
of the point I made.
What, from way back? That's good.
Vicious and anarchist.
Any more questions? Any other specific questions?
I was wondering, do you think that it's similar to
Big tobacco.
big tobacco, how it's capitalized and everything, because it might have started out?
Not in places like Colorado, it's a lot of small business, but other places like Canada, yes, probably similar. They went big corporate. Yeah, well, the corporate world and the governmental world loves that side of the system. In Colorado, they actually broke up one company who had too many franchises. Like the licenses are quite small, and you have to grow for your license, and you can't have 50 fucking shops, you know.
And you've got to remember that in the American
But
situation,
California's different; they're getting more corporate.
in the American situation, you can't really make broad generalizations. There are currently 24 states in the US where recreational cannabis is legal, and 38 where medicinal cannabis is. Now this means that 68% of the American population has access to at least medicinal cannabis, right? The vast majority of the US population. But given that, the regulatory environment in each of the states varies wildly. From California, where it's readily available, right? But it's certainly, if you're going to map out the best possible legislative environment, they've got some odd rules, like growers aren't allowed to sell to retailers, they've got to sell to wholesalers.
Middleman.
Retailers aren't allowed to buy from growers, they've got to purchase from a middleman.
Illegal sales, like
There
organised
are-
illegal sales, mandatory jail.
There are environmental requirements for all growers, right? All growers are broken into either minor, medium or major players. Licenses, you have to buy multiple licenses as you increase your yield, which increased costs. It's a very, very complex system, but like Americans seem to like complex systems. It seems to be working for the Americans at the moment. You go from that California model to, say, Ohio's interesting because it's the perfect example of a situation of a tortured legal and regulatory environment that's the result of incremental change over a very, very long time, right? And There is no way in the world you would ever hold it up as being the way that you'd want it to be, but the outcome is that almost everyone in the state who wants recreational cannabis has free access to it, and the police don't have too much power. So it sort of works for them. Then you get the other end of the situation in America, where you have Republican administrations actively fighting against liberal citizenries, like in Florida. In Florida 5 years ago, there was an overwhelming vote to embrace medicinal cannabis in the state. So the response of the... there was a plebiscite then planned immediately for the legalisation of recreational cannabis. It had massive approval ratings right throughout the state. The medicinal cannabis plebiscite passed in the 70% range. Massive, right? The High Court then refused to allow them to have a recreational one, and the politicians in the state decided that yes, you're allowed to have access to medicinal cannabis, but they classified all vegetable matter cannabis to be illegal, and the only actual medicinal cannabis are pharmaceutical products which are grossly transformed, right? So, in effect, everyone in the state wants marijuana legal, and the Republican administration and the establishment High Court are fighting against the movement.
It's an interesting situation, but here we're still trying to basically get forward. But I hope that answers something about the corporate arm, like Canada is. Australia prefers those kind of models, unfortunately, and hopefully we can get small business through, you know, and localised people, localised grow.
But before we get there, right, Is that
Mr. Mulloway just walked through here? Hi, Mr. Mulloway. How you going?
The very first thing that we've got to do is remember that there is no, in the whole of Australia, there is no such a thing as recreational cannabis. There's only medicinal cannabis,
the Drugs Misuse Act,
and illegal cannabis. That's it. No.
That's structured as an exemption from prosecution in the Drugs Misuse Act. It's not legal technically. It's an exemption. It's not a legal
from prosecution.
Like, it's not legalised. It's an exempt from the Drugs Misuse Act for a couple of plants and 50 grams. So the Act still stands, but it's an exemption for a certain amount. It's a good way forward. Look, more plants will be nice.
I'm in favour of any incremental movement.
Two's a little stingy.
Any incremental movement which legalises currently illegal activity, right? Like, you've got to be pragmatic with this, because as I keep on pointing out, we're not going to get best possible. We're not even going to get anywhere near what we want. The very first systems we have will be grossly regulated, overburdened with all sort of financial and regulatory requirements to make it grossly expensive, restrict as many people as possible, and then we'll move from there. You always seem to start in every one of these jurisdictions, and I've just spent 6 months looking at them all and writing up a nice little
report. It's a good report too. He's got a book. Like, James has written a whole book on cannabis law reform in Australia. That's his book that he wrote, and that doesn't include Thailand.
When was it published?
A couple of months ago.
Yeah.
Recently, this year. It's in the shop over here.
Isn't Thailand trying to remove it now or something?
No. You hear a lot of nonsense talked about Thailand. Thailand is remarkable because it really is a one-off, and there's no way that you can really use it as a corollary for what's happening in Australia. They have just too vastly different a system. And the reasons that you see the laissez-faire legalisation in Thailand has more to do with the corruption of the state than the facility of the total 60% of the retail outlets for cannabis in Thailand are owned or are controlled by people associated with the police force. Right? So
It's an Asian country.
But there is certainly a lot you can take from Thailand. I've been to Thailand quite a few times, and I actually just went on earlier this year. I went on a 6-week fact-finding tour there. Got massively bent all the time. The good facts from Thailand, some really good facts. But I was actually wandering around and asking people at all aspects of the judiciary and the police, right? Civil service, the school system. Look, we've now 14, 15 months beyond legalisation. Can you talk to me about all of the detriments that you've observed that are associated with laissez-faire legalisation? For those who are unaware of the situation, in Thailand it went overnight from a grossly illegal Schedule 1 product, which could see you in 15 to 20 years for possession of a kilo. Overnight they just scrapped all criminal penalties and instituted 3 guiding propositions. The guiding propositions were that sales will not occur to people under 21 years of age, sales will not occur to pregnant women, will not occur to breastfeeding women. And that was it. That was it. That was the total extent of the regulatory oversight, right? When I went to visit, there were 5,300 open dispensaries. For every open dispensary, there's another 2 outlets that are illegal, right? I asked people from top to bottom of that society, all right, what are the harms you've seen visited upon the society? The magistrature, the police, the teachers were unequivocally in favour. I didn't come across a single person who identified negative outcomes. It was all a plus, 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 which is interesting considering I've grown up in a society where I haven't been able to legally smoke cannabis because I've been told since the time I was very young that the government is protecting me against a great many harms. And that these laws have to be there to protect both myself and society from evident harm. So why is it in a society where all of the regulations have been removed, there's no evident harm? Why is it now in America, right? The lived experience of hundreds of millions of people under a fully legal or mostly legal environment has not occasioned any additional harm. I can't see any.
True. Let's just wind this up. Let's start to wind this up a little bit. And we're restricted in pathways in Australia, things that we can actually do. We're stuck within the system. Legalised Cannabis Party has members in the Parliament. There's 5 now. That's a good move, but they're still stuck with what to do, you know, and we don't have the leverage in this country, you know. In Western Australia, they've put a bill forward for a public vote, like a plebiscite at the next election. It'll go on the bottom of the ballot, but that needs to be supported in the House by the Labor Parliament before people get a chance to vote, because we haven't had a chance to vote. So we need to increase the pathways. We need
which in Western Australia is actually the Western Australian Labor Party is possibly the best bet of all of the Labor Party groups in Australia.
Maybe the Cook guy looks pretty stingy myself. He's not about.
Yeah, I know, but just historically.
Historically, they could, and it's a matter of political will. So, you know, we'll wrap this up now. There's another one coming soon. And thank you very much for your questions. Is that all right?
Anyone who has any questions, I'm here for the weekend.
Keep going. Jim's around. And keep talking, people. And
If New Zealand had that referendum and then
they lost by 2%. And it's dead. It's a stupid thing to do at the federal level, but at the state level, it's a good idea. You know, because it's
Thailand reversing?
No, you keep on hearing about this, but because of it became a topic in the